It is 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, the time of deepest darkness in the very middle of the night, when the world is at its darkest and most silent. If the lights go out or you're up in the high country, it's the time of night when you can't even see the barest outline of the hand you hold up in front of your face. It's the time when more people die than any other. The time when the boundaries between this world and the next somehow seem their thinnest. It can be the most peaceful and the most profoundly silent. But it can also be the time when the silence of the world outside you, of the world around you, stands in stark contrast to the noise of the anxious voices making their endless rounds in the world inside you. When your heart and head are the most wide awake, most filled with the fear of whatever it is that the world is handing you at the moment. Whatever it is that files back in when the distracting noise of daylight hours can no longer drown it out. This middle of the night, wee hours of the morning, when you remember most the fear you have for your daughter's marriage that is falling apart, or perhaps it's your own marriage that's falling apart, or fear about the diagnosis that just came back from the pathology lab. It's the time when your mind can't let go of the image it has of your husband who's days away from open heart surgery, or the memory of sirens and confusion after the car accident you were in. The time when you know the gnawing fear that your kids might get sick just by returning to school, or their heartache that you feel in your own heart because they just heard that they can't play the fall sport they love, the one that brings them such joy and keeps them grounded. And you wonder if they can handle one more piece of disappointing news or another single endless day of being isolated from their friends. Or the fear for yourself as you head back to the classroom where all those kids will meet you. Or the fate of your job that hangs in the balance. Or the heartache of the loss that feels ready to consume you. At the start of this most difficult of years, I'd have said, you have probably all been there at least once or twice in your life, there in this 3 a.m. fire zone. But now, 5 months into our pandemic, I'd guess that we've all been there once or twice, or likely even more, just in this last half year. But that's why we need to lean in and listen this morning. Because it's there, in this hour of deepest darkness and greatest uncertainty, that we find the disciples in today's story from the Gospel of Matthew. This same time of night / early morning, when you are most completely between days, most completely between the spaces when you seem to have your bearings and to have things under control, and those where you don't. It's there in those in-between, perched on the edge hours that we find the disciples out there on the sea, out there in a small boat on a very heavy sea, the kind that raises literal walls of water and tosses boats and their occupants with great abandon and unrelenting force, out there in the kind of storm that batters any vessel that confronts it. A storm whose wind tortures the boat, is what the Greek literally says. In Matthew's version, it's the storm that's exhausting the disciples, not their rowing, which is how the Gospel of Mark tells the story. They've been rowing against this battering, torturing wind all night long, the entire time since they put out from shore, just as Jesus commanded them to. And right there is another detail worth noticing. The disciples are in the boat because Jesus told them to be, forced them, it even says. They had all just spent a very long day doing incredible but exhausting ministry. They had been up there on a hill, up there overlooking the sea, and thousands of people had shown up to hear Jesus, shown up to hear him and have them heal whatever ailed them, and shown up too with hungry stomachs that needed to be fed. The disciples had found themselves facing a situation they didn't know how to handle, and Jesus had made a way through. It had been a very long day, like our very long 5 months maybe. And at the end of it, Jesus had set them out to sea, out to the other side, it says, over to the place where those other folks lived their lives, over to the side of the sea where the unclean and the stranger lived. Jesus sent them over there, over to the ones who were different, who were often seen as the enemy, and who surely weren't seen as members of the household of God. They were different and strange and not very welcome. But all the same, that's where Jesus was sending them. And if the story has it right, then the trip over to the other side, to the place of the stranger and the unclean ones, is not always a very safe passage. It can be filled with danger and chaos. The storms can be fierce, can last into the wee hours when the world is at its darkest to begin with. And so there is another detail that's worth noting. The disciples on this storm-tossed sea are not in rebellion, not running away from the mission Jesus sent them on. This is not the prophet Jonah running from the job and getting hauled overboard into the wind and waves. This is the disciples of Jesus, doing just what their Lord asked them to do, going just where he told them to go, and getting storm-tossed on a dark sea just the same. And then there's this, which is also easy to overlook. It's easy because earlier in Matthew, there's another boat on a stormy sea story. And it's hard not to get the two confused or to combine them in your memory. I missed it myself, but it's this. It's the point at which the disciples begin to be afraid. It's easy to think that they were scared of the storm. I surely would have been. But I'm not a fisherman who makes my living on the sea. These guys did, and they were used to sailing on stormy waters. It happens often on the Sea of Galilee, where winds can blow up quickly and with very little warning. So the disciples were surely exhausted, trying to row against the wind and bail the water out and keep a boat on course in the dark and in a storm. But they weren't scared, at least not yet. They weren't scared until they saw Jesus walking toward them on the water, toward them in a place where they least expected him. This was not at all where they'd left him off back there on the shore in the daylight hours. It was his unexpected appearance in the wrong place and the wrong time, and in a way they couldn't understand at all because it made no sense. It was this that terrified them and made them cry out in fear. "It's a ghost!" they shouted. And as soon as they did, Jesus cried back, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Take courage, he said. It's the same thing he says in this gospel to encourage a paralytic and the woman with the years-long hemorrhage. Take heart. Be encouraged, he says. And then this. It is I. Ego eimi in the Greek. It's me, not a ghost. But even more, ego eimi. It is I. I am. Just like the voice in the burning bush when God declared the divine name. The God who alone can bring order into the chaos of the sea, who in the biblical mindset is the only one who could bring life to the chaotic sea that symbolized death. It's this one, walking on, conquering that sea, bringing order to chaos, life to death. This one, whose presence is being mediated by the Jesus whose words to the disciples are, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter, bless him, begins to wonder. "Lord," he says, and he gets the title right. He addresses Jesus as Master. He gets an A for his Christology. "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out there to you." Disciple 1 minute, "Lord," but then the next, sounding just like Satan out in the wilderness with Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, turn this stone." Peter gets it 1 minute, and in the next is testing the very Lord he wants to obey. "If it's you, tell me to come." And Jesus does. He says, "Come." And Peter does. But here's where the troubles begin. This story is often told as a morality tale that says, if you only have enough faith, then you can walk on water too. If you only have enough faith and keep your eyes on Jesus, it'll all be okay. But it's really not quite as simple as that. It's true that Peter does begin to sink when he takes his eyes off Jesus and begins to focus on the wind and waves. And surely there is a lesson to be had from this disciple who represents all of us. But there's another truth here that we sometimes overlook. If Peter had believed Jesus in the first place, had believed that his word could mediate the presence of the creator of the sea and sky, then he wouldn't have started sinking. Wouldn't have begun to feel the waters closing over him so that he needed the hand that reached out to save him. He wouldn't have stepped out of the boat at all. He would have stayed there with the community of the other disciples. He's a lot like the rest of us, this Peter. On target 1 minute, wavering the next. Believing fully 1 minute, doubting the next. I love what it says here about how Peter doubts, because I think it's how many of us doubt too. Apparently, the word used here, the word Jesus uses to ask Peter why he doubted, is a rather unusual one, used only one other time in the New Testament. It doesn't mean doubt as in skepticism, but doubt as in vacillate, go back and forth. Not so much, is it real? But I know it's real. I just can't always seem to hang on to it. Can't always make it my own. It's like that for most of us, this life of faith. Jesus rebukes Peter gently for his little faith. But that little faith is the same one most of us find ourselves having. And Matthew knows this. This little faith, this vacillation, is, as one writer put it, that dialectical mixture of courage and anxiety, of hearing the word of the Lord and looking in terror at the storm, of trust and doubt, which is always an ingredient of Christian existence. Peter's doubt, his failure of faith, was not sinking into the waves. For walking on the water is not the point. His failure of faith was not believing that Jesus' word, which came to him in the boat, was really, truly mediating to him, making present to him the presence of the living God, right there in the boat. Faith is much more a matter of recognizing God's presence right where we are, together with our community, here in our little boat, even in the midst of a storm. So take heart, disciples. Listen up to the word of Jesus. Listen up to the word who is Jesus. And hear what that word is saying to you this morning, right here in this boat. This boat, which these days might be called the USS COVID. Take heart, the world is saying. It is I. Do not be afraid. I am here. I am present. I'm just waiting for you to hear me. Amen.